We saw this, and I told my children, I said, you know what? Let's put on our seatbelts, and then we know we'll be safe. In less than 20 minutes, headed for home, we were hit head on. It's so wonderful, a feeling for me to be remembered because I quit my music career 7 years ago.
She once stood on the same stage as Dolly Parton, sang for presidents, and became the only woman ever named Entertainer of the Year 2 years in a row. Then, at the very peak of her fame, Barbara Mandrell simply vanished. No scandal, no breakdown, no slow fade into irrelevance. One night in October of 1997, she walked off a stage in Nashville and never sang professionally again. For nearly 30 years, fans have asked the same question. What actually happened to her? The real answer has almost nothing to do with the reasons most people assume, and almost everything to do with a choice she made long before she ever became famous. Stick around, because this story is not the tragedy some headlines have made it out to be. It might be one of the most quietly remarkable decisions anyone in country music has ever made. To understand why Barbara Mandrell walked away, you first have to understand what she was walking away from, and how strange her childhood actually was. She was born on Christmas Day in 1948 in Houston, Texas, into a household that looked nothing like a typical American home of the era. Her father, Herbie Mandrell, worked as a police officer, but music ran through him just as strongly as the job did. Her mother, Mary Ellen, played bass in the family band. Instead of a living room full of toys, the Mandrell house was full of instruments propped against walls and stacked in corners, as ordinary to Barbara as furniture. She was reading sheet music before she could comfortably read a children's book. She picked up the accordion first, and from there she never really stopped. Steel guitar came next, then saxophone, then banjo, until by the time most kids were still learning multiplication tables, Barbara Mandrell was already being paid to perform. At 11 years old, she played steel guitar at a music trade show in Chicago, and a guitarist named Joe Maffis happened to be watching. He was floored by what he heard from someone so young, and he invited her to perform with him in Las Vegas. A 12-year-old girl sharing a Vegas stage with seasoned professional musicians sounds almost unbelievable today. But Barbara handled it the way she handled everything musical, with a calm confidence that seemed to belong to someone twice her age. Within a few years, she was touring as part of the Mandrell family band, sharing bills with legends like Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, and George Jones while she was still a teenager. She never really had a childhood separate from the music industry. The stage was her playground long before it became her career. And then, right as it looked like nothing could slow her down, she stopped. At 18 years old, Barbara married Ken Dudney, a drummer who had spent years playing in her family's band. Ken soon left to serve as a Navy pilot, and Barbara made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She walked away from performing entirely to build a life as his wife. There was no farewell tour, no press release, nothing dramatic. She simply stopped, as if the extraordinary years she had already spent on stage were a phase she had outgrown, rather than the center of who she was. For a while, it looked like the story of Barbara Mandrell the performer had quietly ended before it had really begun. It took one ordinary night to change everything. Barbara went with her parents to watch a taping at the Grand Ole Opry, expecting nothing more than a pleasant evening as a spectator. Instead, sitting in the audience and watching the lights hit the stage, she felt something she couldn't ignore. She wasn't supposed to be watching from the seats. She was supposed to be up there. The feeling was strong enough that she went home that same night and told Ken she had made a decision. She was going back. In 1969, she signed with Columbia Records, and the career that would eventually make her a household name officially began. It's worth pausing on how unusual this is. Most performers spend their whole lives chasing that first big break and never look back once they get it. Barbara Mandrell had already tasted a version of stardom as a teenager, walked away from it voluntarily, and then chose to come back on her own terms. That pattern, choosing what she actually wanted over what fame demanded of her, would define the rest of her life. There's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked. Barbara wasn't just returning to a career. She was returning as a young wife whose husband was serving overseas in the Navy during wartime. Building a music career from scratch while managing that kind of distance and uncertainty would test anyone's resolve. She leaned on her family for support during those early years back in the business, and in many ways, her sisters Louise and Earlene became not just collaborators later on, but part of the foundation that helped her balance an unpredictable industry with an equally unpredictable home life. That closeness among the Mandrell sisters would end up shaping some of the most memorable years of her career, long before anyone knew a hit television show was in their future. Her return to music wasn't an instant success story, though. For years after signing with Columbia, Barbara toured constantly, recorded steadily, and worked as hard as anyone in Nashville, but the charts didn't reward her the way her talent deserved. Musicians who worked alongside her knew exactly how good she was. Audiences who saw her live left convinced they had witnessed something special. But commercial breakthroughs are unpredictable, and for a long stretch, Barbara's biggest hit remained just out of reach. That changed in 1978, when a new creative team encouraged her to stop chasing trends and just be herself. The result was Sleeping Single in a Double Bed, her first #1 single, and it opened the floodgates. If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right followed, and by 1981 she had recorded I Was Country When Country Wasn't Cool, a song that would go on to define an entire era of country music and later become an anthem covered and referenced by younger artists for decades. The awards followed the hits. In 1980 and again in 1981, Barbara won the Country Music Association's Entertainer of the Year, becoming the first performer in the awards history to win it 2 years in a row. That achievement alone would have been the highlight of most careers, but Barbara was just getting started. NBC gave her a primetime variety show, Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters, where she performed alongside her real-life sisters, Louise and Earlene. Week after week, viewers watched her sing, switch effortlessly between instruments, act in comedy sketches, and host the whole show with an ease that made it look simple, even though almost nobody else in the industry could do all of that at once. What made the show so unusual for its time was just how much of it rested on Barbara personally. She wasn't simply the star of a variety hour with a supporting cast around her. She was often the connective tissue that held each episode together, moving from a vocal performance straight into an instrumental solo, then into a comedy bit, then back out to introduce a guest, all without ever appearing to break a sweat. Audiences responded to that versatility in a way that few performers before or since have managed to replicate. It's part of why, decades later, people who grew up watching that show still describe her as one of the most talented all-around entertainers country music has ever produced. Not just a singer with a great voice, but a true multi-instrumentalist who could genuinely do it all live, in front of millions of viewers, week after week. Behind the scenes, though, the show was quietly wearing her down. Producing a weekly variety program while touring and raising a family is an exhausting combination for anyone, and Barbara began to feel the toll in her health and her voice. The show was successful. It could easily have run for several more seasons, but instead of pushing through for the sake of ratings or fame, Barbara made the call to end it herself. It was an early example of something she would repeat throughout her life. When success started costing her too much personally, she chose herself and her family over the show business machine, even when nobody was forcing her to make that choice. Then came the moment that changed everything, and it had nothing to do with career decisions at all. On September 11th, 1984, Barbara was driving on Highway 31 near Hendersonville, Tennessee, with 2 of her children in the car. A 19-year-old driver, heading the opposite direction, crossed the center line and struck her car head-on. The crash was devastating. The other driver died at the scene. Barbara survived, but with injuries that would have ended most people's careers permanently. A severe concussion affected her memory and concentration for months. Her thigh bone was broken, her ankle was shattered, several ribs were fractured, and her knee was badly damaged. Her children were also hurt, though far less severely than their mother. There's a detail from that day that Barbara has returned to again and again over the years. Earlier that same morning, she had introduced a new family rule. Everyone in the car wears a seatbelt, no exceptions, and she buckled her own to set the example. It was the first time she had done that simply to model the behavior for her kids. A few hours later, that seatbelt may have been the difference between life and death. Nobody can prove that with certainty, But Barbara has said many times that she has never doubted how much that one small decision mattered. What followed the crash was, in some ways, harder than the accident itself. Barbara's physical recovery stretched out over roughly a year and a half. She went from a hospital bed to a wheelchair to grueling physical therapy, relearning how to walk normally again through sheer repetition and willpower. But the injuries nobody could see were just as serious. She struggled with depression and significant memory loss in the aftermath, losing pieces of both her personal history and details from her career that she had to slowly rebuild. To the public, she remained the same warm, composed performer they remembered. Privately, she was fighting a battle that very few people around her fully understood. As if that weren't enough, Barbara then found herself at the center of a public relations disaster she never asked for. She filed a lawsuit connected to the crash, seeking to recover the substantial medical costs for herself and her injured children through available insurance coverage. It was a practical, almost bureaucratic decision, but the way parts of the media covered it made her look cold and calculating, framing the story as a wealthy celebrity going after the family of a young man who had died. That distorted narrative followed her for years and added an unfair emotional weight to a season of her life that was already devastating. There's also something worth noting about how differently this kind of story might have played out for someone with less resolve. A crash of that severity, combined with the emotional weight of losing a young man's life, and then facing public backlash over a lawsuit she never wanted to be controversial in the first place, could easily have pushed anyone toward giving up entirely, whether on their career or on their sense of self. Barbara has said in interviews over the years that there were periods during that recovery when she genuinely wasn't sure what her life would look like going forward, physically or emotionally. The fact that she eventually walked back onto a stage at all, let alone continued performing at a high level for over a decade afterward, says something about the kind of resilience that doesn't always make it into the highlight reel of someone's career. And yet, in the middle of all of that pain, there was real joy too. In 1985, while she was still working through her recovery, Barbara gave birth to her third child, a son named Nathaniel. She has described that period of her life as one of extraordinary contrast, holding some of the deepest pain she had ever felt alongside one of the greatest blessings she had ever received. It's a detail that says a lot about how she approached hardship throughout her life. She didn't pretend the pain wasn't there, but she also